welcome you all to our National Poetry Month event and to introduce our poet, Vera Schwarcz, who is a very old friend of China Institute. As many of you know, China Institute was founded in 1926 by two intellectuals, the American John Dewey and his student Hu Sheng, who was one of the leaders of the May 4th movement of 1919 in China, with the mission to broaden the appreciation and awareness of Chinese culture among Americans. Their mission could not be more poignant today, as the relationship between the US and China is ever more intertwined, and the study of Mandarin is at the forefront of foreign language studies. Arguably, China has produced a significant part of the world's treasure trove of poetry, and if it were not, for poets and scholars like Vera Schwarcz, many people would not be able to enjoy or have access to Chinese history and poetry. Professor Schwartz is the director of the Freeman Center for East Asian Studies at Wesleyan University and Mansfield Freeman Professor of History and East Asian Studies. She is the author of many books, including The Chinese Enlightenment, Intellectuals and the Legacy of the May 4th Movement in Modern China, and Place in Memory in the Singing Queen Garden. Most recently, Vera's two new works were published: Brief Rest in the Garden of Flourishing Grace, which is a collection of poems of remembrance and loss by the Manchu Prince Yi Huan, and Chisel of Remembrance, which is a collection of her own poems, which draw from roots in Jewish, Chinese, and other ancient traditions. Vera has been bridging languages and cultures for decades, and is in many ways the embodiment of China Institute's mission. We are delighted to have you back with us this evening to share your passion with all of us.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be at the China Institute twice in one semester. I was here a few months ago on a very cold day, and I was talking about the book about Singing Queen Garden, and this is a very different event, I hope. I want to be hooked up, but let me know if it's hooked up. And I want to acknowledge many dear old friends in the room, but especially Rose Siegel Ibsen, the artist whose work graces the Chisel of Remembrance. We have been friends since she had an exhibit at Wesleyan. She is Romanian. She looks Chinese, but she isn't, or Korean or Japanese. But she's actually Jewish from Romania and a very accomplished, world-renowned calligrapher in Chinese tradition. Several painters are here, and I'm especially indebted to my dear friend Janet Luongo, also a painter, who has kindly agreed to video this event. What I want to do is begin with a few poems about poetry. They are renditions, very much entering the Chinese text and then departing from it in a considerable measure. So this one is called Senses After Mengjiao. Hold with the past. Don't lose its taste in your mouth. Silence the sound of old chronicles in your ear, let your song easily crumbles. Dull the scent of ancients on your robe, and your brush withers on silk. Lose sight of cracks in oracle bones, and your sword breaks. Forget the touch of greening bronze against your skin, and your zither too laments. In ancient days, the master's tears for the loss of the past fell streaming in torrents. The master here, of course, is Confucius, and it's interesting that Meng Jiao in the Tang Dynasty looked back to Confucius as a mourner for the art of poetry and the connection to history. So the last poem in this collection that I want to, this part, is called Confucius Feasting. And it's based very loosely on a commentary in the Zhuojuan, an ancient Chinese chronicle that describes a moment in the life of Confucius. Confucius Feasting. Once when the master journeyed, he happened to hear an ancient ode. For 3 months, he did not taste meat, mourning the death of songs. My disciples, why does no one cherish the book of odes? Their lines stir dreams, Their rhymes teach you how to complain against the powerful. Their music recalls forgotten words. Their silences instruct a noble heart. For the next 3 months, Confucius feasted on ancestral names. Crane orchids, camphor laurel, phoenix tail bamboo. So with Confucius morning, I want to sashay to some poems from this other collection. I've been very privileged, puzzled. There are 2 books of poems come out in 1 week. This one was 2.5 years delayed, and this one was marvelously timely. Now these poems are based sometimes on the life, sometimes on the poetry of the Manchu prince Yi Huan, who lived between 1840 and 1891. He first came to my attention as a literary source about the gardens of northwest Beijing that I was working on and wrote about in the book that came out last year. And over the 7 years that I kept company with Yi Huan, he became more and more central to me and my thinking about poetry, not about the gardens of northwest Beijing. And who would have thought, when I was at Stanford and working on modern Chinese intellectual history, I'm honored to have a dear teacher, Professor Al Dean. There's no greater joy than students at teachers meeting, unusual settings, so I feel very privileged to have a teacher here. But certainly I was not interested in ancient Chinese history or not in Manchu princes in my radical days at Stanford. So it became to me a surprise that I spent 7 years in this intense conversation with a very highborn Manchu prince. Yi Huan was brother to a mid-19th century Emperor Xianfeng, father to the last 19th century Emperor Guangxu, grandfather to the last Emperor Puyi. So he's the top of the Manchu nomadic nobility that ruled China in the last 300 years before 1911. But as many of the highborn Manchus, they spoke Manchu, but they were highly educated in the Confucian tradition. And Yi Huan, especially like most of the highborn Manchus, chose a Chinese studio name for himself. Yi Huan is interesting. He wrote this poem when he was about 19 years old. What happened to him was another short poem that he wrote as a young man on his way to his own garden called the Wei Shu Yuan, the Garden of Flourishing Grace, which was very adjacent to the old summer palace. And again, a very young man, a very light poem in the springtime. On the way to Wei Shu Yuan, a cloud of cabbaged butterflies, drunk with spring, tie up the air's unruly curtain. Egrets cast languid shadows. A guest of lapis waters, I tried to cut the cord that ties me to the realm of red dust. Pick up my rod,